Hello, welcome back. I'm Dan Powers, the Executive Director of the Society for Science and User Research Facilities, and I'm grateful to welcome you to our next session. This is going to be a panel discussing diversity, equity, and inclusion programs at user facilities with a couple fantastic examples and some engaging conversations, actually ways for you as well to be involved as audience members as you ponder the questions and themes that are put forth by our great guests. I'm going to introduce our moderator, who will then be introducing the other panelists for this discussion. And we're going to be impressed and engaged. So I'm fortunate then to start by introducing Dr. Mamie Parker. And Dr. Parker is a professional fish and wildlife biologist, and she's also a success coach and a principal consultant at Ecologic Group. Dr. Parker made history serving as the first African-American Fish and Wildlife Service Regional Director of the 13 Northeastern states after working in the Great Lakes and Big Rivers region and in the Southeastern United States. Her career as a biologist and senior executive in the federal government also has included leadership roles as the Fish and Wildlife Chief of Staff, Assistant Director of Habitat Conservation, and also Head of Fisheries throughout the country. She's known for her public speaking throughout the environmental community, and she's given commencement addresses and speeches for several organizations, including Duke University and the World Fisheries Congress in China and the Oprah Winfrey Academy, and the Office of the Prime Minister of Lesotho in Southern Africa. When I met Mamie and we had a discussion about the topic of this panel, her enthusiasm and actually deep committed awareness of what both is the current zeitgeist of this conversation, but also what is not necessarily being spoken about, what needs to be brought up in these kind of conversations with a broad spectrum of scientists really impressed me. And of course, her enthusiasm and her skill at this type of topic was just magnetic. I should also mention that one of our board members, Michael Becker, had just recently earlier this year, saw Dr. Parker speak, and that was part of how we got to become aware of both her speaking style and her skill, her intuitive knowledge into this realm of diversity, equity, inclusion topics. So let me turn this over now to Dr. Mamie Parker. We'll be hearing from two other panelists. Natalie Holder is going to be speaking, as well as Linda Isakson, but I will let Mamie take over the introduction of her fellow panelists and look forward to a great hour here of being enlightened by what is occurring within a couple of these user facilities that will be focused on in this conversation. Thank you, Mamie.
Dan, thank you so very much. I appreciate this opportunity and this wonderful invitation. And I've already had a great conversation with both Natalie as well as Linda. I'm grateful for Michael for thinking about us, and certainly appreciate my fellow scientists that are out there doing great work in all of these facilities throughout the country. It's been my pleasure to learn more about what you are and what you do, and really excited about the fact that you want to do more and be more. And so with that in mind, I thought maybe we would just talk about in this conference about supporting, creating, and sustaining a diverse community. And we do have a schedule here, and I want to make sure that everyone has an idea of what we're going to be talking about today. And of course, I will introduce the subject, and then we'll have Natalie on, Linda will talk, and then we'll have some interactive sessions with the panelists before we talk about the polls. In every organization that I have the privilege of going to, I love to talk about these community agreements. I serve on the board of the National Wildlife Federation, the Nature Conservancy, and many other boards. And it's here that we have these community agreements, and we're reminded of them every time that we have meetings. And I just thought they would be important for us to share those. So you out there in user facilities, these might be something that you want to think about doing too. Recognizing the burden people with marginalized identities have to endure but embrace discomfort in this subject matter, practice empathy, assume good intentions, practice both and thinking. Why am I talking? Why am I not talking about some of these DEI issues that are important? Be easy on some people. Some people, they require us to be harder on. Be hard on ourselves to make time for these priorities when it comes to DEIJ issues. This is all about all of us feeling welcome, and not just one group of people, not just one group of individuals, but all people feeling good about being at the table. And you'll hear more about that from the wonderful speaker when you hear Natalie, because this is one of the things that's really, really important to her. But my mama was an individual. I called her the Oprah of the outdoors. And one of her great sayings, when all is said and done, sometimes more is said than done. And so today we're hoping that you are reflecting now on things that you have already done and some things you want to do more of. Ben Franklin says every day before he went to bed, he'd ask that question, what good have I done this day? And so this is all about what can we do as a community, and also what can we do individually on the subject. I believe the subject is all about allyship and belonging, and how do we overcome many of the barriers that we hold, particularly those of us who are history makers. And you're going to hear from some history makers and some individuals that got some great things to say, but we're going to also ask you some of your opinions as well. But as a person of color, the one that's been the first in many cases, whether it was my first experience in a laboratory in La Crosse, Wisconsin, the fish disease control laboratory, where I did a lot of research and work there with some great scientists, still had to overcome and still overcoming many of the isolation issues, the exclusion issues, the micro and the macro aggressions, as well as racism and sexism. I would love for these things to go away, but they're still here. And even in spite of the fact that I've had the privilege of working as the head of fisheries in this country, many times briefings at the White House and other places experience this. And so I'm hoping that eventually it goes away. But today we're talking about real talk and how do we support, create, and sustain this DEI community, the real talk. I try very hard to listen to my nieces and nephews and my great nieces and nephews, and they tell me all of the time, Auntie, we just have to do the thing. And so I'm trying to make sure we know what those things are. And if you don't have time to listen to the rest of what we have to say, hopefully you'll get these points, because I'm sure you'll hear them from both Natalie and Linda, as well as many of you in the audience that will have a chance to speak on this subject. These systemic problems, we have to figure out ways to address those. Inclusive and safe places for all people, raising the awareness of this unconscious bias that we have, amplifying and empowering voices that may not always get heard. And as I spoke earlier about individual commitments and collective efforts. But most of you are like me. You grew up in an environment, some of you, quite a few of you, in a government environment. And I started as a GS2, as an intern, and I saw lots of things that could be different when it comes to this environment and this subject matter. But we never ever think about what we should do in terms of imagining the outcomes. I think that we sometimes, because of fear, false evidence appearing real, we have a tendency to think that the outcome will be something that will not be beneficial to all. And the message that I give is just like this bumblebee here. And as a fish and wildlife marine biologist, I always say that they pollinate and they do great things, but every now and then they have to sting too, and they do that. And so this subject, as we support, create, and sustain a community that we're trying to, we have to get stung every now and then as well. My mother was an avid angler. This is her. I was born about this time of the year, just celebrated her birthday a day or so ago. During the time of the Little Rock Nine, was trying very hard to get into Little Rock Central High School. The governor didn't want them there. The president of these United States of America, President Eisenhower, sent troops into Little Rock. And on his birthday, I was born. My mother wanted a boy. She had already had 5 boys and 5 girls, and she wanted a boy to take fishing with her. She was an avid angler and loved the outdoors. She had planned to name that boy after the president. I'm so glad Mama didn't name me Ike. I was given the name of the first lady of the country of the time. But one of the things that she always taught us was that we are a part of a family. And that's what I'm most impressed about your society and what you have, what you're doing. You are a part of a larger group, and you have great things that you can do together in this DEI world. And hopefully you will continue to do this. This is where I caught my first fish, Bayou Bartholomew, the longest bayou in the world, over 367 species. And I have the privilege now of going back there and doing and helping others do research here at that bayou. Save nature to save ourselves is so important, and it's a message that Colin O'Mara from the National Wildlife Federation. As I think about my life here as a civil rights child, 3rd grade right there in the middle, but went to a school that looked more like this one over here with these little boys in it, where it was just all white school, because someone thought it was a creative idea to send this little black colored girl to an all white school in the late 1960s, where we had not integrated our schools. I had some really lonesome days because the parents in that community basically told their children not to play with me. And so I sat there day after day after day without anyone. And then one day, a little girl like this one with the blonde blue eyes came up and she said, "I'm a leader." My mommy said, "I'm a leader and I should play with you. And if I play with you, June would play with you. And if June plays with you, Donna would play with you." And so it was here that she took it upon herself to play with me, and she was right. Others started doing the same thing. Opinion leaders are so important in this community, and hopefully at your facilities that you will find those that not necessarily might be in a leadership position, but might be opinion leaders. Marvin Gaye introduced me to the outdoors and inspired me to do research on pollution. I heard his song, "Mercy, Mercy Me, Things Are Not Like They Used to Be. What Happened to the Blue Skies?" And then he said radiation in our air, and he said fish full of mercury. And I lived off the land. I lived off the fish and wildlife in my community, but I also lived near Georgia Pacific, where there was a lot of air pollution, and there was a lot of pollution from air crop dusters as well. And so my inspiration came there. It continues as I think about all the places that I've lived and had the opportunity to work as a scientist, as a biologist, and as a leader in conservation, whether it was Wisconsin, Minnesota, Missouri, Georgia, Massachusetts. All of these places allowed me as an individual to watch other scientists like yourselves out there embracing us and lifting as we come, but certainly struggling and not always doing our very best and making our best better when it comes to this subject that we're talking about. We didn't always hear people that actually called out racism. We didn't hear people that often thought about whether or not I belonged or others belong. We didn't hear people talking about historical trauma and psychological safety concerns. We didn't understand our early childhood experiences had some impact on us. And we certainly didn't have a lot of people at that time increasing allyship and accessibility and undoing many of those unconscious biases. These are our stretch goals. These are the things that we need to work on, but there's hope. I feel like there's hope, and had the privilege of going to see these items on the sidewalk in Dubai as I went to Joe and Mika Brzezinski and others at the 30 over 30 and 50 over 50 Forbes Women's Conference last year in March, to see that this is so important that it made it to the United Nations as one of our global efforts. And so as we close, and I close my remarks and hear from the experts on diversity, I tell people I'm not an expert, but I've lived diversity in very isolated situations and really, really learned a lot and can really, really learn more, but also when you learn, teach is what my fellow Arkansan Maya Angelou says. Select a day-to-day strategy to optimize our collective and individual ability to improve our environment for our students, for our faculty, for our professionals. And that's what I'm hoping you all will do. Find that one thing that you can do. And hopefully you'll share those as we continue this discussion. And so in the interest of time, I'm going to keep us moving. And I am so excited about the opportunity to introduce our next speaker, Natalie Holder. And Natalie has done an outstanding job in her field. And like many, she is one of the first to do many things. And in this space is one in which she certainly is what I consider one of the best. And when I had the privilege of reading her bio, she is a keynote speaker, a strategic architect, cultural change management. That's what she's all about. And she's one of those that I mentioned earlier that actually has moved the needle when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion in high-profile work environment. Currently, Natalie, she serves as the Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer at Stanford University's National Lab. Again, she was the Assistant Chief of Police at the U.S. Capitol, the first African-American Bureau Chief and mentoring program there. Natalie is an employment lawyer by training, and she's developed harassment prevention training products and led seminars for organizations such as Yale University, Medical School, Time Warner, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture, as well as the United Way. Her work has been featured in the New York Times, Working Woman Mother magazine, and a variety of radio and television interviews. She started her career as an associate specializing in disability discrimination litigation and is the author of 2 books. Natalie, we're so happy to have you here, and we're excited about your telling us a little bit more and bringing us to some context around diversity and inclusion. So welcome, Natalie.
Thank you so much, Mamie. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the introduction. I just have to make one correction. I was not the Assistant Chief of Police at the U.S. Capitol Police. I was their Chief Diversity Officer, their inaugural Chief Diversity Officer. However, during my tenure, that was the first time in their 100 years plus history that they'd ever had an African-American woman become the Chief of Police at the U.S. Capitol Police. So with that, I also want to thank SSURF for pulling this meeting together, and also for inviting this conversation around diversity, equity, inclusion plus. Oftentimes people ask the question around, what do we need to do to be intentional about making change? What do we need to do in order to be able to make change in our organizations? And it oftentimes starts with just a conversation. I'm a big believer in the whole idea that in order to have social change, you have to have social exchange. So with that, I'm going to share my screen so that I can give you some context as to the work I'm doing at a national laboratory. As Mamie mentioned, I am the Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer and the advisor to the director at SLAC, which is the National Accelerator Laboratory at Stanford University. And I've been enrolled for about almost 3 years. So it's a very new program that we have. However, there's been years of groundwork that definitely preceded me. All right, so as I mentioned, it's so important to know where you want to go in this space. So the goal of my conversation for all of you is to give you a sense of what have we been doing at SLAC and what have been some of the outcomes. I want to give you some examples and some possible strategies that you might be able to implement in your organizations. Number one, it's so important to understand, what are your root causes to the issues that are, impeding the diversity, equity, and inclusion that you're hoping to see in your organizations. I also think you have to be honest and mindful about the terms diversity, equity, and inclusion. If diversity is a proxy for race, gender, sexual orientation, disability status, and so on, then it's always going to be problematic because you're always going to have people who don't believe that they're part of the conversation. But if diversity really is about the confluence of people of all different backgrounds, being able to have a voice in an organization, being able to contribute to an organization, being able to have access to an organization, then that really is the true diversity. That often will create allyship and create great champions. As Mamie mentioned, it's so important to have opinion leaders. Your opinion leaders need to also feel as though they can be a part of this process. So my goal number one, when stepping into this role, and it was the inaugural role at Stanford and the National Accelerator Laboratory, our goal was to figure out, what really has been, getting in the way of, increasing diversity when it came to certain groups. And I also wanted to see which were the groups that were, historically underrepresented. For us, our historically underrepresented groups were Native Americans, African Americans, Chicanos, Hispanics, Latinos, and women. And then really having a clear sense from our employee resource groups, what have been their experiences by having focus groups and really gathering their narratives. Narratives are strong. Mamie's narrative, I just wanted to ask a lot of questions after hearing her narrative, because once again, the narratives really do help to inform where and how the organization has been able to progress. I also wanted to speak to my associate lab directors to get a sense of what work has already been done. What have they been experiencing as leaders of our laboratory? And also, speaking to people who have been at the laboratory for 20 plus years to really understand historically where we've been. I even went into our historical archives one day and I saw that Panofsky, who was our very first lab director in the 1960s, he actually hosted these lunches with, at the time, it was called the, African American Staff Association. He would have these lunches just to check in and see how are they experiencing the laboratory and making sure that they felt welcomed. So like I said, SLAC had this history, but now is a question of, okay, so how do we make sure that all of these actions and what have been taking place, how do we make sure that it all coalesces into one strategic mission? As I mentioned, this is my strategy. It's an overall, it's a very executive level view. But these are the steps that I believe in taking oftentimes when, once again, identifying, where are you and where do you want to go? Next, I started looking at what are our policies, our practices, and our procedures. I wanted to get a better sense of, how do we operationalize the diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy that we were building? And notice I say we. The Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Office should not be the only office or the only place in the organization that owns this work. It really should be a shared experience throughout the organization, because oftentimes the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Office, we don't own recruitment, we don't own many of these policies, and we ultimately don't own who gets promoted in your organizations. So it has to be a shared conversation. And so I wanted to also then think of what would this all look like, a few years down the road, if we are able to properly identify what our challenges are, then attack those challenges by looking at our policies, practices, procedures, and even behaviors. Who would we become at that point? And so the goal is to say that, we are a place that's getting it right, a place that can be recognized, not just for, the work that we're doing in diversity, equity, inclusion, but really understanding how this work drives our mission and is making our science that much richer and much bolder, because once again, we're having the voices of a number of different groups and teams that are a part of the conversation. When you add a diversity lens to many initiatives, you are now identifying the blind spots that may exist. Your teams are not going to move as quickly or as nimbly as they could if everyone's thinking the same way. When you start to throw in people with different ideas and lived experiences, that's when it feels like you're moving through molasses. But the great thing about moving through that molasses is that you oftentimes are getting to much better solutions. It's been scientifically proven, by the way. All right, so who are the people who are part of my office who help to inform my work and also help to make sure that I'm able to understand what's happening within the directorates? As I was putting together my plan, I realized there's no way that I'm going to fully understand the experiences of a high energy physicist or a basic energy scientist. And so I quickly reached out to my associate lab directors. I sat on the senior management team with them, and I asked, could you, what we call in the law, in the legal profession, could you second or could you matrix someone from your department into my office on a part-time basis so that we could all work together to figure out what practically would work for our organization? And luckily, a few of the directorates were able to matrix some of their people. And as you see, from the people who have the clear hexagon, those are the people who are matrixed into our office. And as liaisons, they not only bring information to my office, but they're also pushing out our message and our resources to their directorates. We also wanted to make sure that we started with senior leadership because, as they often say, without senior leadership really buying into an initiative, it's going to have a much different and a much more difficult path than if you are going from groundswell, movement upward. Having the leadership buy in and then being able to trickle down the messages, the language, the behaviors, that's when we're able to really see systemic change in an organization. So I developed what I call the diversity, equity, inclusion leadership journey for our senior management team. These were a series of sessions in where we went to, a real, in-depth understanding of what have been, historical barriers for various groups. How and why do LGBTQ plus employees feel unsafe in the workplace? What does systemic racism look like in our society, much less our organizations? And, really then, having the conversations around, what are these experiences that people in our organization may be carrying with them? We also wanted to make sure that we brought in our employee resource groups and made sure that they were, working cross-functionally with other laboratories. Once again, the whole idea of benefiting from that diversity of thought and really being able to, have much more, thought as well as participation by way of looking at what are some of the other national laboratories doing, and we've been able to host events in where we've had over 1,000 people participating in conversations around things like imposter syndrome. What does it feel like to be the first? And stereotype threat. And then ultimately, making sure that our communications are also pushing out, what are we looking like in our organization? What do we value? So that when people are looking at us in the employment landscape, they could see this is what it's like to work at Slack. When we put a message on LinkedIn, and trust me, all of your potential candidates, before they join your organization, over 90% of them are looking at who they're going to be working with on LinkedIn. We wanted to make sure that we had this forward-facing message to show that this is what our culture looks like, and we welcome you into it. So as I mentioned, the goal also was to really look at how do our systems and how do our policies and practices sometimes create other isms that we might not have thought about. And this is where having the liaisons in my into my office, as well as hosting monthly Chief Diversity Officer updates, comes in handy, because I'm not going to know every policy in the organization, and more importantly, I'm not going to know how they land on everyone. And so members of our LGBTQ plus population came to me and said, from the moment that I entered this site, I felt othered because I couldn't check the box in terms of gender. At the time, we only had binary ways of looking at gender. And, there were, of course, there were some, barriers, because we do want to make sure that we're aligning with the DOE, which does ask for this information for radiological purposes, and being able to, obtain this information for, tracking biological differences to people who may be exposed to any sort of chemicals or any sort of, hazards at our laboratory. However, we were able to work with our legal department, we were able to work with our safety department, and we were able to work with a number of different areas in the organization to say, there actually is a way to make sure that we're meeting that goal, but we also want to meet the goal of meeting our people where they are. So we've been able to add a few more identifiers to our site access form. This is the form that you have to sign in order to get a badge, in order to even visit our laboratory. And so now people who are visiting who might not be able to check male or female now have an option. We also noticed that there was, an opportunity to increase the resources for people who were looking for reasonable accommodations, who were visitors. Employees were taken care of by our HR policies. However, there wasn't a policy regarding how do we accommodate visitors? How do we accommodate the professor who wants to attend with, his or her students or their students to a colloquia at Slack, and that person might be hard of hearing, that person might be deaf. And so we were able to, work with Stanford to get a number of resources that would be able to provide the kind of accommodations that we could provide and should provide for our visitors. And so while many people might be thinking right now, well, you haven't really provided any statistics on how you've been able to increase different groups, or, what are your targets when it comes to, what diversity means, or what your goals should look like, and what success should look like in terms of, how many or, what increase in certain groups you're able to seek. I'm one of those people who actually is reticent to do that, because to me, that's a numbers game, and people are more than just numbers. I prefer to look at, what is the organization? What are people feeling and experiencing about the organization? And so I'm really big on culture climate surveys, juxtaposed with historical and also year-over-year tracking of who's coming into our organization, who's leaving our organization, and who's being promoted into our organization. And when we, surveyed just how our employee resource groups, which really are the spaces in where people oftentimes can have the conversations that are beyond the brochure, the safe spaces, this is where I said our work is definitely on the right track. And I still see room for improvement. So you might be asking, so what's an example of intentionality? What's an example of, what someone could possibly, institute in order to, pursue an initiative that really does increase access to your laboratory, access to your organizations? One issue that we, noted was that we have over 100, well over 100 minority serving institutions. However, we were only scratching the surface with them, and we weren't really engaging with them in a way that we could really say that this would lead to a scientific collaboration, or relationships that would create a scientific collaboration. So with the help of the Department of Energy and their WDTS program, we got funding in order to launch our Minority Serving Institute colloquia. This is where my scientists leave their laboratories, we leave SLAC, and we go out to these wonderful MSIs, minority serving institutions, and we share our science with them. Our goal is to make sure that, as people are putting together scientific collaborations, they understand the excellence that exists at these institutions because they visited, and they also understand what might be some of the barriers and where there might be great opportunities for advancement. Okay, I think maybe I'm at time. If I have maybe another minute, I could go to another slide to once again give another example of intentionality.
Yeah, yes, one more minute. Can you wrap up? That'd be great.
All right. I'm going to just very quickly say, look, one of the other areas we realized was we weren't getting out to, many of the affinity conferences, the professional conferences. These are spaces in where they are looking for talented people to be speakers, to be presenters, to also conduct recruiting. And we were able to see that by being out in these spaces, we were able to start attracting and raising awareness about SLAC. Let's just be honest, when people hear SLAC, they often think it's a communication platform. So the Department of Energy also this year, many of you know, launched what were called the peer plans, promoting inclusive, equitable research. And these are plans that have to be attached to every funding request. This, your diversity, equity, inclusion offices are great spaces to partner with when you're putting together a peer plan, because they can actually provide you with, great resources in terms of, what training could be provided. What should your team be looking at proactively? At Stanford, we have the Center for STEM Mentorship, which actually looks at 4 different areas that oftentimes stymie groups: understanding, trust, vulnerability, and conflict resolution. And, many of these resources are free. So, as the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Office, oftentimes, you're relegated to just looking at employees. However, I've expanded the aperture of that at my laboratory, and I say, no, I look at everything from tech transfer to, how and where people experience our organization. And many of those initiatives were poured into peer plans. And I'm proud to say that, we're a collaborator on a few projects that have yielded over $62 million for SLAC.
Great. Thank you so much, Natalie. That was very inspiring, and even made people like me think about things you talked about, the imposter syndrome, the employee resource groups, pushing messaging out by others, finding those other allies that could do that. And what are people feeling? I just think that's great to hear more about that survey. So great. I appreciate all that you shared with us. And now we're going to move on. And again, I apologize for getting, I don't know if that's a promotion or a demotion in claiming you as to be the assistant police chief of police at the nation's capital police. But I want to move on to our next speaker, and we're very fortunate to have Linda. And Linda is a communications, public relations, and outreach professional. And she has over 20 years in the public service that she's devoted to doing this work. Currently, she's the communication manager for the Department of Energy and the Office of Science and Environmental Molecular Sciences Laboratories. So she's a fellow environmentalist. Overseeing the website, the social media channels, the events, the user engagement and communication. And in this position, she's a great advocate for these user facilities in driving scientific innovations. Linda started her career in the state and local government in environmental compliance, and she developed and managed municipal water quality programs, and she led communications for state oil spill and hazardous waste responses. And then she made her way over to government-funded national laboratories into our community. And she has an MS in ecology from the University of Michigan and an MPA from Evergreen College. Linda, join us so we can get some great wisdom from you on this subject.
Thank you, Mamie. Welcome all, and thank you so much for joining us today as we discuss how we can all work towards a scientific community that reflects the diversity that is all around us. As stewards of federally funded resources and as conscientious members of the scientific community, EMSL, or the Environmental Molecular Sciences Laboratory, is responsible for ensuring equal access to our user program, and we are committed to joining national efforts to address discrimination in science. So last year, we started developing a formal plan to improve the diversity, equity, and inclusion of EMSL's user community. And our formal DEI plan was published in January of this year and can be found on the EMSL website at emsl.pnnl.gov/about. So before I launch straight into EMSL's DEI plan, though, I want to give a bit about us so that you can understand why this DEI strategy is so important to our operations. So as we mentioned, we are a DOE, Office of Science user facility, that supports fundamental science in the biological and environmental research program's mission space, which is also known as BER. We offer 680 plus worldwide users access to our 150 instruments in support of their science. And we work on more than 250 active user projects each year. So our expertise focuses on three critical areas for BER. So one is how molecular processes in air and water and soil drive large-scale Earth systems. Two, we look at how proteins and biomolecular processes influence growth and resiliency of plants and the rhizosphere in the face of changing environmental conditions. And three, we analyze the mountain of data that's generated to turn it into meaningful information, and then assess how to include these molecular processes into large-scale predictive Earth systems models. Now, to accomplish this ambitious science mission, we rely on air, water, earth, and plant samples that contain information from all areas of the world, from the permafrost at the Arctic, the coniferous and deciduous forests of the north and mid-latitudes, grasslands, tropical rainforests at the equator, down to Antarctic glaciers and everything in between. And with this necessary diversity of samples, we recognize that this comes with a necessary diversity of research users. So diversity in their scientific disciplines is critical, diversity in their perspectives, diversity in their backgrounds. And so this is why EMSL is committed to fostering a welcoming and inclusive culture. We believe that our two DEI goals, we believe that our two DEI goals to intentionally build a diverse user community and to provide equitable access to EMSL's resources will help to promote strength and resiliency in the broader scientific community. We have two critical pillars of our DEI strategy. The first is to minimize unintentional bias in our proposal selection process. So to work towards this goal, we've adopted a dual anonymous peer review proposal selection process for one of our open calls. And our second goal is to foster meaningful collaborations that reduce barriers to funding and research opportunities. So for this journey, we seek to build deep and impactful collaborations with several HBCUs, or the historically Black colleges and universities across the US. Proposals that are received by EMSL for any of our open calls are vetted through a peer review panel, and the highest rated proposals are selected. So it's much like how proposals are selected by many of your institutions as well. And yet, we know that unintentional bias is still able to creep into the selection process. So for instance, like reviewers may know who the PIs are who submitted the proposal. In seeking ways to reduce review bias and thus promote more equitable access to EMSL's resources, we outreached to NASA to discuss how they implemented their dual anonymous peer review process for telescope time. And we had heard that they saw success in the number of women and first-time proposers that were gaining telescope access. So I'm actually going to interrupt my own script here to acknowledge that there's a person in the audience right now, Allison Hatt, who we have so much to thank for getting us onto this path. Allison used to be our the manager of our user program services, and she was instrumental in bringing this to EMSL. So I just wanted to give that acknowledgement and shout out. So as at this point, though, you may be asking, like, what is a dual anonymous peer review process? Well, I mean, already users don't know who are reviewing their proposals. And so now the review panels will equally not know who the identity of the proposal team are who are submitting this proposal, as the proposal is completely anonymized. They have to strip out any identifying information about their team members, their institutions, and their partnering organizations. So using NASA's SAGE Council and how to implement this whole process, last year we piloted the dual anonymous review process with our exploratory research open call. And to be frank, this was a challenging process, and we learned a lot along the way. I mean, we had to teach users how to submit an anonymized proposal. So there's a lot of outreach for that. And we had to train the reviewers to solely focus on scientific merit, mission alignment, and the impact that their proposals had for our DOE sponsor, the BER program. The panel also had to be monitored so that they wouldn't speculate on the proposer's identity during their discussions. I mean, it's human nature to want to know, right? So we worked to improve the diversity of our review panels by bringing in an intentional mix of gender and career stage, or folks with a mix of genders and career stage, and also the type of institutions that they represented. I know that we're all data people here. And unfortunately, I really don't have any fancy charts or trendline data to present to you about the ramifications of this dual anonymous review process, because it really is still so new and evolving, and we're learning where biases arise in the system and how to operationalize the whole process. But what I can tell you is that in the last year, in the first year that we did this, we saw roughly 30% uptick in the number of women and new PI proposals that were selected, which again was just last calendar year. So for this calendar year, I don't have the demographics data yet for the accepted proposals because the exploratory research call closed not too long ago. But what I can tell you and let you in on are a couple wins. That first, this year, we added a postdoc position to our peer review panel. And second, we saw proposal submissions for minority serving institutions double from previous years. We do plan to continue using this dual anonymous peer review for our exploratory research call, and we're going to continue monitoring its long-term impact. Eventually, we will assess to see how we can use this review process for all of our proposal calls. Now, moving on to our second pillar of our DEI strategy. So for the first few years, EMSL had generally promoted our events and proposal call opportunities to contacts within the huge list of minority serving institutions. And as you can imagine, realistically, that was an effort that was too wide and too shallow, and it really didn't create the kind of impact that we seek to make. It also didn't help to meet our goal of building that diverse user community with any kind of meat behind it. So this year, we made the executive decision to focus on building targeted, meaningful, and impactful collaborations with HBCUs. We started with the existing colleagues that we have, and now we are working directly with 3 HBCUs specifically: Central State University, North Carolina A&T, and Alabama A&M University. So through these partnerships, we've already submitted 3 DOE FOA proposals with a HBCU faculty person as lead PI. And we were also able to tap into the 1890 HBCU Land Grant Universities Network, which is a huge win for our respective environmental research programs. We hope that through these strengthening partnerships that we're able to cultivate internship opportunity or internship pipelines by connecting our researchers with their students and staff for, the multitude of the DOE funded internships, like the Office of Sciences graduate student research and the undergraduate student research, the visiting faculty research, that also allow up to 2 students to join the faculty member.
Thank you so much, Linda, and we appreciate your enthusiasm. And it's obvious that, I love that anonymous proposal review. That just seems like something, especially when you can see some results. And what we've heard from both of our speakers, the fact that people like to see numbers, especially those of us who are scientists. And so it's great to be able to have that. I'm going to ask Natalie to join us again. And any reflections, any thoughts that you guys had from what you heard from each other. And then we're going to pull up our poll and have you all elaborate a little bit more on the poll. So we'll take a couple of minutes just to see your thoughts from each other. Anything in particular?
So Linda, I also commend the dual anonymous peer proposal review. There are so many different ways in which bias does creep up into processes. And actually there's, a lot of really good data around how you can do all of the unconscious bias training that you want. But it's when you start attacking the processes, that's really where you get to the root causes. I'm sure everyone's heard about, the study about, the orchestra that started to use, blind studies, but you could still hear the sounds of, people's feet walking. And so once again, women were oftentimes not selected. Once they started to carpet the ground, that's when you saw an increase in an uptick in women who are now added to the orchestral pits. So, I think similarly, that's a great process. I know that with our internship processes, we've also stripped out the names and the GPAs of our students, because once again, we're really looking at the content and the quality of the work that they're doing. And a GPA tells a part of the story, but it doesn't tell you, who's working 2 jobs. It doesn't tell you who might have been, going to school at night. It doesn't tell you who might have had a parent that they were caring for, or even, some other caregiving responsibility.
Or
So,
some traumatic experiences in their life right then and there that they've overcome. And how do you get some of that reflection? Linda, anything you have to add? And we're going to look at the poll. I'm going to ask our producer to pull up the poll. Anything you want to add before?
Just that, no, I mean, thank you, Natalie, too, for discussing how you are, how Slack is, intentionally improving your internal staffing, implementing DEI strategies for your staff. And so I just wanted to elaborate to our audience here that, Natalie's focus was on staff, and our focus here was on our user base, predominantly because as a user facility that is managed by a larger national laboratory, we don't necessarily have the ability to do staffing issues. That's handled at another institution. But Natalie, the stuff that you talked about was great, and I'm looking forward to actually reviewing your slides once again to see if there's nuggets that we can pull from that for our own, culture building at EMSL. So thank you.
Natalie, are your slides available for others to use and if they want them, they can contact you and you can be selective in sharing those as long as you are comfortable with that.
I will put my email address in the chat. I look forward to hearing from anyone who'd like to, start the conversation.
Well, one of the challenges that we are finding is in building diverse peer review panels. I think that in recruiting more diversity into these review panels has been a challenge that we've really been facing, and trying to work with our user executive committee to overcome by having them help us get the word out that we're looking for all kinds of different perspectives and backgrounds of people to join these panels. So I can tell you that operationally has been a challenge that we're trying to overcome.
Mm-hmm.
And so, Linda, hearing that challenge, I would then, wonder, how have you extended relationships with faculty or with, other members of the MSIs that you're building relationships with? Might this be an opportunity to give them another sense of, connection to your organization? Just to kind of, look at a different layer of the user experience. Once again, I look at, the staffing issues, right? So we actually found that it's also important to make sure that users are, abiding by our values. We want to open our spaces to, different users, but we had to be mindful about making sure that users were, treating our employees respectfully, making sure that users were, not engaging in the kind of conduct that, would create a climate that would be, adverse to our employees. So that's also like another element that it's so important to look at with user facilities. You have bad actors,
Mm-hmm.
and how do you address that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's great that you mentioned that. We just also implemented a code of conduct for our users as well that addresses those issues, everything from how to engage with other users and our staff, how to promote a safe and inclusive environment, for in their workspace as well, and several other factors. So it's great that you mentioned that.
And those codes of conduct are so key because, oftentimes people are scrambling in the dark when something happens. But when there's a code of conduct, you have already looked at proactively what is going to be your MO in resolving this issue. Who are going to be the people who are pulled in as resources and as experts, and it's also sometimes, shining a light on where might there be deficits in terms of who has the skill set to resolve these issues.
Absolutely. Michael has shared some of these, and I just kind of want you all to look at them and find one or two that you feel that would be something you want to respond to, react to, inspire these individuals to move on. So what I'm seeing here, some comments from Argonne National Lab. He's scrolling down. Still learning and listening. Isn't that important? I love that. Still on the journey, more courage to speak up, moving beyond awareness toward action, still learning and growing. Some injustice everywhere, all around us, in the complex way it harms our research. Yes. Where are the organizations in this space? Any thoughts on that?
I love that, the courage to speak up, because that really is so important for us, just identifying and being those leaders. As you mentioned earlier, Mamie, it takes that one person that says, I'll play with you, or I see this, and let's work together to address it and move forward. So
Anything else? Great. Let's see the last one. What do we want it to be? Well, we could do more targeted outreach to improve diversities, councils to continue to collaborate with the laboratories as a whole, reaching out to everyone. Natalie, you spoke on everyone at the table when we had our separate meetings. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
So I like to use oftentimes we like to think that it's important to bring people to our table, that we've already set the table. We've already put the meal on. We already, have the utensils out. However, we're not thinking about what individual needs may require a different, dietary restriction, a different utensil. And so it's so important to make sure that true collaboration takes place when you are reaching out to, schools or students or entities that might be historically underrepresented. It's important not to have savior syndrome and believe that you figured it all out and that you have the best way of going about it. Because once again, we really can all learn from, others' practices. We all have, areas of deficiencies. And it's really, once again, through those rich conversations of not just, demographic, but also cognitive diversity that we are able to, locate where there are opportunities for enhancement.
Right. How do we deal with the big elephant in the room of there, I remember after George Floyd, it was like I was overwhelmed with a lot of people that were actually wanting to do more and didn't see the way. And then I live in the Commonwealth of Virginia outside of the Washington, D.C. area. And we've seen the opposite now, where I've gone to meetings where they said, don't be too woke. So can we talk about how this is shifting a little bit, and how do we, how do we navigate through situations like that, and the facilities that are really wanting to be champions? What do we do, and how do we help them? Wow.
That's so funny. I just, I always wonder, what does that term woke mean anyway? I guess in my mind, it's just how to be a decent human being. Like, I don't know. I don't think we've really come across that necessarily. I mean, it seems like so far people have been pretty supportive of the work that we're doing. So I don't know.
Great. That's great. Anything you want to add to that, Natalie, as we close out?
One of the things that I, would have shown in in the unabridged version of my strategy, it's that you've also got to look at the political landscape within which you are. And right now, the Biden-Harris administration is definitely advancing so many initiatives, Justice 40, I can't think of the other one. There's like a racial equity executive order that's out there. And so, right now is the time to get a lot of this work done. But then also you've got to be smart about changing, political landscapes. And so to make this work sustainable, like I said, you've really got to be honest about what do you mean about diversity, equity, inclusion. My business case to my organization is that we are aligned with the mission. There is no way that you can create 21st century science by simply having people from the same schools, the same backgrounds, and a lack of heterogeneity. Mm-hmm. And so when people do see where there have been great enhancements and great limitations, I mean, you've all heard the example of, being able to wash your hands and being a person of color having difficulty because the hand sensors were not designed for people who had pigmentation. That's a huge limitation. You're going to lose sales at that point. So it's being able to provide examples like that of where if you had different voices in the room, different lived experiences, you may have been able to identify that issue a whole lot faster.
Great. I do see Dan is here now, which means that it's time for us to end our session. I'll just end by saying thank you. I really appreciate the wonderful information that we received from the both of you. We could go on for another half an hour. We had planned to do a different poll. We do have the information that we'll keep from the audience, and I know that it'll be used in some way by SSURF, and we appreciate it. And again, thank you for this opportunity, Dan, and we appreciate it.
Welcome. Yes, thank you all. I think the information from the poll and the conversation that's got started here, we have everyone who registered for the event. We can reach out to you again. I think it's obvious that another session that would go a bit deeper into each of these topics, we can make that available and look to schedule something really just in the next, let's think, a month or two. We'll just get it out on people's calendars enough. But I'll be reaching out to Mamie and Linda and Natalie, and we'll arrange another conversation. So thank you all there. I think I know I can see you in the smaller boxes up top. I think everyone else can see that. But thanks. You really got some wheels turning there. I'm particularly interested, and I know I've heard from some other communications folks throughout different user facilities, the reference to the, I wrote it down, that acronym you had, Natalie, the PEER program. It caught my attention that even just the sound of it sounds like PEER, P-E-E-R, and that's something intriguing there, that you're building a network and informing how people are engaging with the organization, even though you aren't using the word peer in the way that I was just spelling it. There's a lot more that I'd like to learn about that. And the HBCU outreach that Linda was describing, that's also something that people are very interested in. Oh, thank you. You put that into the chat, Natalie. All right.